Well, thank you, Dan. It's really a pleasure to be back here in my old stomping grounds. I spent many years at UCLA when I was in mid-career stage, about 18 years altogether. So when I think back on that, that sort of amazes me that it was that much time I had spent there. So I really appreciate the invitation to come back and talk with you again. I also have to apologize somewhat for the repetitive nature of what I'm going to say. That those of you who are veterans of Beck have heard an earlier version of this talk many years ago, over a decade ago. But I'm going to compensate you by giving you slightly updated new data. Same theory, but new data. All right. Theory of Gendered Prejudice comes out of a model of intergroup relations I've been working on for a number of years called social dominance theory. And basically, social dominance theory, which I'll very briefly introduce, consists of, it was started by one basic observation, and that observation is that human social systems seem to be ubiquitously structured as group-based hierarchies, with one group at the top of the hierarchy and one or a number of groups at the bottom. And this seems to be relatively ubiquitous. There are differences in the degree of hierarchy between one society and another, and degrees of hierarchy within a given society over time. But the fact of group-based social hierarchy seems to be a constant. The second observation, or the second assumption, is that after observing this hierarchical nature of human social organization, we make the assumption that human social systems are probably predisposed to be organized as group-based social hierarchies. That's one. Second assumption is that the most common forms of social oppression, such as racism or slavery, sexism, nationalism, etc., are really simply special instantiations of the general tendency of human groups to form group-based social hierarchies. Given this, the project that social dominance theory tries to attack is to try to identify the multi-leveled and interlocking mechanisms responsible for the creation of group-based social hierarchy and the recreation and maintenance of this system of social organization. And these mechanisms include things like individual differences or situational constraints, the behavior of institutions, of legitimizing ideologies, and social and group identities. So we assume that there are really three basic types of group-based social hierarchies. One of these systems is based on age, where a distinction is made between juveniles or children and adults, where adults have more political and social power and military power than children do, than adolescents and children. And that's not particularly controversial. It's a given. The second form of social hierarchy is a little more controversial, and it's the patriarchal system, or patriarchal system. And by this we mean that in society after society, you have a system in which males dominate females economically, politically, militarily, where most of the heavy decisions are taken by males, and where males oppress females to one degree or another. Now, there are certainly differences between the degrees of patriarchy. Some societies are extremely patriarchal, like Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia, and others relatively egalitarian, like Scandinavia. But despite those differences in degree, the fact is that there is a consistent tendency for males to dominate and exploit females. There are certain exceptions to this system of patriarchy among social mammals. One of them, there are 4 exceptions we're going to go through. One of them is found with the bonobos. The bonobo is a species which is really matriarchal in its political structure, where the females form political coalitions with one another and determine how goods and services, so to speak, are to be distributed within the troop. So that's one exception, right? And by patriarchy, we mean that there are no exceptions to this tendency to form systems in which males dominate females. Now, that's not to be confused with matrilineal societies, which there are several of, in which one's social membership or one's group membership is a function of who your mother is. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about patriarchy. And we're going to make the assumption that patriarchal systems are universal across not only certain social species, like chimpanzees, is perhaps the most extreme version of a patriarchy, but also among humans. So bonobos is one exception. A second exception is found among the Moraki monkey, in which there is no physical dimorphism to speak of between males and females. And this is a society which is or a species which is genuinely egalitarian. The third exception to the patriarchy is found among the lemurs of Madagascar. There are about 100 species of this critter, okay? And to the extent to which they have political structure, that structure tends to be matriarchal, not patriarchal. And the last and most dramatic exception to the rule of patriarchy is found among the spotted hyena, in which the female is the larger, the bigger, stronger, more ferocious, and more aggressive of the two sexes. Okay, but those are generally the only exceptions to this iron law of patriarchy. Okay? The third type of social hierarchy is what we call the arbitrary-set hierarchy. This is a hierarchy built upon socially constructed differences between groups, such as race, class, tribe, clan, religion, lineage, nation, and minimal groups. Okay? And it's on this third type of social hierarchy, which is what we're going to concentrate on today primarily. Now, the sub-theory of gendered prejudice basically says that gendered prejudice theory should be thought of as an intersectional or interactional theory of arbitrary set discrimination. And by arbitrary set discrimination, we mean discrimination that one suffers by virtue of being a member of a given arbitrary set group. Okay? And the degree to which we can observe arbitrary set discrimination is going to vary by gender or sex. That arbitrary set discrimination will be conditioned by sex or interact with sex, which is the basic thesis. So secondly, we're going to say that the effects, we've already said this, the effects of arbitrary set discrimination are conditioned or moderated by gender. And the first argument we're going to make is that, in general, among humans and chimpanzees, males will display higher levels of arbitrary set discrimination than females will. And things like xenophobia, outgroup discrimination, outgroup aggression, social predation, social dominance orientation, which we'll explain in a minute, will be higher among males than among females. And this will be a general truism. Second argument is that, in general, not only will males be the primary target of arbitrary set discrimination, but they will also be the primary perpetrators and targets of arbitrary set discrimination. That will not be the case for females. And the third and last argument is that the motives for arbitrary set discrimination are going to be somewhat different for in-group males and in-group females. So that arbitrary set discrimination will be proximally driven by some combination of aggression and social dominance orientation among in-group males. But that will not be the case for in-group females. Well, why should arbitrary set discrimination be conditioned by gender? That's the first question. And basically, being influenced by Darwin's sexual selection theory and Trivers' parental investment theory, we have the recognition that males and females are confronted with substantially different reproductive constraints, opportunities, challenges, and risks. That for males, the obligatory reproductive investment tends to end after relatively costless production of millions of sperm and the act of fertilization. And the obligatory commitment to males ends at that point. That's not the case for females. That is to say, females have to bear the relatively high reproductive costs of gestation, parturition, lactation, and the not insignificant risk of mortality in childbirth. And lastly, men and women also differ in the length of their reproductive lifespans, in which males are reproductively capable for significantly larger sections of their lifespan than are females. What we're assuming is that the result of these differences in the reproductive opportunities and constraints upon males and females will have socially consequential reproductive strategies. So we can think of reproductive strategies as forming a continuum from parental effort, which is predominantly a female strategy, to mating effort, which is predominantly a male reproductive strategy. But there are combinations of both of these efforts, parental and mating, found along this continuum. This difference in emphasis on parental versus mating effort will have behavioral consequences. Among females, one of the consequences will be relatively high mate choosiness, relatively high investment in offspring, and relative preference for high status and high provisioning mates. Among males, there'll be a tendency for higher levels of promiscuity, high strivings for status and power among males, and resource control, and high male versus male competition. Now, the back and forth between the two strategies of male reproductive strategies and female reproductive strategies we argue, are going to have socio-political consequences. And one of them is going to be the emergence of patriarchy, in which males dominate the reproductive choices of females and tend to engage in coercive sexual advances on females and politically dominate over females. Among one of the consequences for males is that there will be a arbitrary set hierarchy and competition dominance among males in order to get resources and status that females prefer. And to do this, males will tend to form extractive male-on-male coalitions to extract resources from other groups. If these assumptions are correct, it'll lead to at least two consequences, and actually three. What are they? The first hypothesis is the invariance hypothesis. That is to say, if males are oriented towards the extraction of social resources from outgroups and the control of female sexuality, but of in-group females, then there'll be a tendency for a dimorphic personality or psychology that differs between males and females, such that the dominance orientation of males, everything else being equal, will be greater than the social dominance orientation of females. And what do we mean by social dominance orientation? It really depicts the preference that males have for hierarchically organized extractive competition among societies, among elements of societies or groups in society. And it's measured by an instrument we've developed over the years called the social dominance scale, or social dominance orientation scale, which consists of items like to get ahead in life, it's sometimes necessary to step on other groups. Inferior groups should stay in their place. Superior groups should dominate inferior groups. And all groups should be given an equal chance in life, which is the obverse of the first three. We've tested this several hundred times in various societies and looked at the potential for moderation of these male-female differences in dominance orientation. And we've looked to see whether or not the gender difference is moderated by age or nationality, ethnicity, religion, education, income, child-rearing practices, etc., across all of these possible moderators, and found no evidence of substantial moderation of the gender difference in SDO. But the most up-to-date and definitive study of this is a meta-analysis of the published findings on SDO and gender differences in the literature. And this is a study done by Lee, Prato, and Johnson in Psychological Bulletin in 2011. And in this meta-analysis, they looked at 101 samples of over 28,500 respondents across 16 nations, and not found one single case in which the average SDO level of females was higher than that of males. Okay? So this seems to be a well-established finding. And we're not going to talk about it more unless you have a question about it. The more interesting hypothesis coming out of this work is what I call the subordinate male target hypothesis. And let's first define ASD as arbitrary set discrimination, which I've mentioned before, which is the discrimination you suffer by virtue of being a member of a given race, class, ethnicity, religion, whatever, by being a member of a given arbitrary set. And B is the degree of relationship between discrimination and arbitrary setness. So that basically what this statement is saying is that the effect size of arbitrary set discrimination suffered by males will be significantly greater than the effect size of arbitrary set discrimination suffered by females, which might or might not be greater than 0. Now, if you think about this for a minute, this is a pretty radical statement. Among other things, it argues that the very popular notion of double jeopardy, that is to say, having a double handicap if you're a female and member of a minority groups, is basically wrong. Females will suffer from a singular type of discrimination, and that will be based upon their gender, but not based upon their race or arbitrary set group membership. The nature of the evidence, there's a great deal of evidence supporting this. The nature of the evidence can be found in survey evidence, archival evidence, and experimental evidence. Since we don't have an infinite amount of time, I'm going to concentrate on the second two, archival evidence and experimental evidence. Let's start with evidence of arbitrary set discrimination a la the subordinate male target hypothesis in the employment sector, in the labor market. Basically, when you look at average wages of males and females and the differences between them, you see a rather substantial difference in the wages earned per year using 2008 data of white males over black males. It's about $10,000 difference. Among white females and black females, it's a much smaller difference in wages paid. Okay? But this doesn't really control for anything. It doesn't control for human capital investment, the amount of education one engages in, or other kinds of human capital investment. So one of the things that we can look at is to look at what happens to one's hourly wage as a function of the amount of human capital investment in one's education. So that everything else being equal, the more one educates oneself, the higher the salary is, which is consistent with census data taken from 1960 and 1980. And let's look at the racial differences between white and black males. For every additional year of higher education white males undergo, they make a 78-cent more in salary versus the rate of return on investment for black males, which is 56 cents more per hour in salary. And that's in 1960 data, census data. In 1980 census data, what happens? Well, everybody's income goes up, right? That doesn't surprise us, comparing 1980 to 1960. But what is critical here is that the average return on investment for white males and black males stays relatively constant. Let's look at what happens with females in 1960 and 1980. In 1960, Females earn about 58 cents more per hour for every additional year of college education. Black females earn slightly higher than that in 1960. What about 1980? If anything, black females are getting a higher rate of return on educational investment than white females are in 1980. What these data show is while there is at least some evidence for racial discrimination among males, there is no evidence for racial discrimination against females in these data. It simply doesn't exist. What we did was follow up on this analysis using the 2010 census data. And we basically find a very similar pattern, that for males, they get a much higher rate of return, white males, a much higher rate of return than black males. And there's this very much smaller difference in the rate of return for black females and white females. But it's still the case that white females get a slightly higher rate of return in 2010. But this data are consistent with the second hypothesis. We said that the difference for males will be significantly larger than the difference for females, which is what these data say. Well, what about moving it beyond the white-black contrast? These are data of the income, 1994 income, as a function of race, education, and gender, and we can start out with males. And this is male income for no high school grads, some college grads, and advanced degrees. And what we see here, among those who are poorly educated males, there is no racial difference among them in salary. As the income level, the educational level goes up, there begins to emerge a clear racial difference, which is consistent with our findings, which is that among highly educated individuals, males, white males, earn significantly more than Latino males, brown, who earn significantly more than black males. There's a clear racial difference along the lines, which is not surprising. What about females? Well, for females, not surprisingly, they earn less money than males do. But what's critically important in these data is that there is no racial difference in the amount of money earned by females. It's completely non-existent here, 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 here somewhat, and here a little more. Once again, among females, there is no evidence of racial discrimination in the salaries that they're paid. If anything, black females earn slightly more. Please, I'll skip over. These are very new data developed by Chetty, Hendren, and Jones and Porter, 2018. And what it shows is intergenerational transfer of income from parents to children. Okay? And what you find is a general tendency for downward mobility, that children, offspring, earn less money than their parents do. But that is also conditioned by race and gender. Among males, white males suffer from downward mobility significantly less than black males do, right here. So these can be read as income differences for the level of the parents' income in percentiles. That is not the case with females. If anything, black females earn more money than white females do. And this data set is based upon 20 million respondents, parents and their children, their offspring. Okay. Another interesting implication of this is that the degree to which we observe income differences between blacks and whites, that is completely due to the differences found among black and white males. If we're just defining black-white differences between females, there's no racial discrimination at all. Okay. What about experimental evidence? So far we've been looking at archival evidence. Most of the time when we're looking at experimental evidence of discrimination in the labor market, we use audit studies or correspondence studies. That is to say, we send black and white or white and Latino people to look for jobs, to answer job ads with the same education, looking for the same job, with the same experience, the same age, the same suit of clothes, the same everything. And what data generally shows is that whites or dominants, members of dominant groups, are much more likely to be hired than minorities are. And that's a universal finding, except it's conditioned by gender. Now here is an audit study developed by Array and Bursell in Sweden. And it looked at the employment discrimination level against people with Arab-sounding names, as opposed to Swedish-sounding names. It's a Swedish study. And with the same background, it looks as if this is the callback ratio difference. So here it looks as if white females, the Swedish females, are being called back for a job interview at twice the rate that Arabs are. Mm-hmm. And there is no gender difference in that level of discrimination to speak of. But then Arai and their colleagues did a very interesting change to the design of the matrix. What they did was give the Arab job seekers 2 more years of job-relevant experience to see what happened to levels of discrimination after this was done. And what you find is the following. Once the Arab females are more qualified than their Swedish sisters, it turns out that there is no significant difference to speak of between the callback ratio given to Swedish women versus Arab women. No difference at all to speak of. That was not the case among males, in which the more highly qualified Arab male was much less likely to get called back than his Swedish compatriot here. But this bar is the level of discrimination, basically, among males, Swedish and Arab. What about the criminal justice system? Well, you'll not be surprised to discover that on the y-axis here we have the rate of incarceration by 100,000 individuals taken from the 2010 census. And what these data show is that white women are much less likely to be imprisoned than black women versus Latino women. But there are huge levels of incarceration for males, for white males, Latino males, and especially black males. So if you look at the ratio, discrimination ratio for women among Latinos, it turns out that for Latino women, they're much more likely to be imprisoned than white women are. But for the difference between males, white and Latino, the difference of imprisonment is even stronger. There's a stronger race effect among males again than for females. And that difference is even stronger among African Americans. The race effect is there for black females compared to white females, but the ratio is much higher for black males compared to white males. What about other kinds of experimental evidence? This is the shoot-no-shoot ratio we're going to talk about. Generally, what happens is you give white males, black males, white females, black females, an ambiguous object in their hand. And the person's job is to decide whether to shoot the object with a kill shot or not. Right? So it's a decision to shoot. And when you do this, there are two kinds of mistakes you can make. One is you can mistakenly shoot an unarmed suspect, or you cannot shoot an armed suspect. Mistakenly shooting an unarmed suspect is the data in the white bars, and mistakenly not shooting an armed suspect are in the dark bars. Concentrating for a minute in the white bars, you see that black males are shot at significantly higher levels than white males are, which is not surprising. What is somewhat more surprising is the probability of mistakenly shooting a black female is no higher than the probability of mistakenly shooting a white female. There are no differences between these bars. And there are no differences between the error rate for shooting white males as compared to black females. In other words, once again, we see no evidence of a racial difference in the shoot decision in this experiment. Yes, ma'am? That was not looked at in this study. Okay, just who the targets were. Later on, we're going to look at the gender and race of the perpetrator, but that's coming soon. What about the prepared fear paradigm? This is another experiment, and it's a little more complicated, so bear with me. There are two kinds of critters in the world. Dangerous ones, like venomous snakes and poisonous spiders, and harmless critters, like ducks and butterflies. Okay? So what if we engaged in classical conditioning of the dangerous stimuli, the dangerous animals, and the non-dangerous animals? And it's done in the following manner. For each pair of dangerous and non-dangerous, every time the subject saw a picture of a dangerous critter, the same dangerous stimulus, the viewing of that dangerous critter was associated with an electric shock and white noise. Okay? And the same thing went for prepared stimuli. So there's a conditioned stimulus for the prepared stimuli and the same conditioned stimulus for unprepared stimuli. The dependent variable was how long it takes that conditioned response to dissipate after electric shocks and white noise were no longer given to the suspects. And it turns out that it depends upon the race of the target. So they decided to take this paradigm and apply it to human groups. So here we have a conditioned stimuli and unconditioned stimuli among the unprepared stimulus, and a conditioned stimuli and an unconditioned stimuli for the prepared groups. And what Olsen and Phelps and compatriots found was that it was much more easy to classically condition outgroup males compared to outgroup males. They acquired the conditioned response more quickly as compared to the extinction, so that when the stimuli was no longer being conditioned, the conditioned stimulus response went to zero. It dissipated after a while. Okay? But that did not happen for the outgroup face. So regardless of whether the subject was black or white, opposite race targets, the response to them was much more tenacious. It lasted much longer. But what's missing in this paradigm is the factor of gender. According to the subordinate male target hypothesis, this tendency to have a prolonged fear response of the target should be conditioned by the gender of the target, such that you'll find this pattern for males, but you won't find it for females. And so we decided to repeat the experiment and basically look to see whether or not you had a lingering conditioned response among males but not among females, which is what the data showed. If we look at female targets, the female responses disintegrated to nothing significantly greater than zero for both in-group female targets and out-group female targets. It made no difference. The conditioned response also degraded to non-significance with in-group male targets. What did not happen was that the response, the fear response to the outgroup males lingered. Yes, ma'am.
Can I just ask a clarifying question?
Mm-hmm.
The participants in this study and the former study all white, or different?
They were, in one, we did it in 2 blocks with just white respondents or white targets and black targets. And we found the same pattern. So outgroups, outgroup male targets were conditioned with fear much more consistently than females were. What this did not look at was the gender of the respondent. We're just looking at the gender of the target. So we did a quasi-experiment looking at that factor, and we call it the Vladimir's choice experiment. And Vladimir, it's called Vladimir's choice because it comes from an old Russian fable which says that Vladimir is this very poor, dirt poor farmer with 15 kids and very little to eat. And one day God comes down from his heaven and he says to Vladimir, "Vladimir, I'll grant you one wish. Anything you want, I will grant you." Anything I want? Yep. No holds barred. Anything you want. There's only one catch. Anything I give you, I give Nikolai down your road, your neighbor, twice as much as you get. Okay? And Nikolai and Vladimir thinks about this, and he thinks about it. And finally he says to God, God, I've made up my mind. I want you to take out one of my eyes. Okay? So we call a spiteful allocation. Okay? So we set up an experimental paradigm to sort of mock them, not by blinding our subjects, but by saying that the University of California was going to withdraw university support to student organizations based on race and gender. And the subjects could choose 13 different options for how that money was to be taken away. Generally speaking, you could take $13,000 from in-group, or from racial and gendered in-groups, $13,000 for this group and this group, or you could only take $7,000 from the in-group and $1,000 to the outgroup. Now this is a rational response. Why is the left one a rational response? That's right. It's the least costly to you. The only problem with this response is that it is giving more money to Nikolai, or it's taxing Nikolai less. A less rational, economically rational response, but a spiteful response would be this response here, where you're willing to pay $19,000 more than you would have to pay. Here you only have to pay 7, here it's 19. But the advantage of this choice here is that come on.
Stick it to that.
You stick it to the other. That take out both of his eyes. Okay? This is a spiteful response. And the argument is that the probability of a spiteful response in this paradigm will depend upon the outgroup, in-group distinction, and conditioned by, come on, gender, conditioned by gender. Okay? And that's exactly what the data showed. Here, when it's a female target and a female respondent, females, a rational response is below the 0 point, and a spiteful response is above the 0 point. When it's a female respondent and a female target, there are rational, economically rational allocations made. When it's a male respondent and a female target, there is no evidence of a spiteful allocation. But when it's a male respondent and a male target, then we get this spike right there. Okay? Much more likely to give a spiteful response. Take out both of his eyes is what this response is. Okay? Yes, Michelle.
I realize that you're focusing on the differential, but I'm questioning a little bit the initial scale without arguing that the points on the scale should be ranked differently. Wouldn't it have been a little more tight to have said to the participants, every organization is currently receiving 100,000, so
Right.
that the taking out of the one eye and the taking out of 2 eyes is somehow more standardized. It doesn't allow for people to say, well,
Well, they
We're
saw
only
this.
getting- We're only getting 25,000, that's gonna wipe out this other organization completely, versus we're getting 100,000, they're gonna only lose a fourth.
Right.
I understand that the ranks on the scales are correct.
Right.
But somehow it would be more aesthetically pleasing to me if you had told everybody, all the organizations are currently getting 100,000.
Okay.
So that
What
when we take money away, it's proportional to those numbers there.
Mhm.
It's not, it's
Well,
not
what
gonna
they-
wipe
what-
out some, and in other words, reduce my acuity by 2020 to 2040 versus take out my eyes completely.
Mhm. Well, what the subjects do, they get this matrix, the entire matrix, and they can make a choice as to which of these combinations of allocations they prefer. Okay? So, I mean, your suggestion is a good one, I think. We haven't done that. But this is good enough to make our point. Okay? Lastly, what about, we did a fourth study, an experiment, looking at the dependent variable is extinction bias, the same one which we dealt with before, as a function of levels of aggression, levels of dominance orientation, the gender of the target, and the gender of the participant. Okay? So we're looking at potentially a four-way interaction. Thank God, none of the interactions were significant concerning female targets. Okay? When you're looking at female targets, there is no effect of the extinction bias for any combination of the others. The only data which showed significant extinction bias is for male participants versus male targets. So when male participants had high levels of aggression and high levels of social dominance orientation, there was a significantly high level of extinction bias, but not for female targets. Okay? So, additional evidence for Smithy can be found in the retail sector, where there's evidence that males pay a higher, outgroup males pay a higher price for retail purchases than white males do, or there is an interaction between gender and race. The education sector, the housing sector, etc. So I'm going to wrap up by posing the following questions. What we don't know yet is, does Smithy generalize across different kinds of arbitrary sets? We know it works for the distinction between whites, blacks, and Latinos, but does it work also between religious groups, differences in religious groups, or nationality groups, or different kinds of distinctions? That needs to be further studied. Secondly, does the Smithy hypothesis generalize across different cultures? Thirdly, is Smithy limited to both negative and positive social allocations? The Vladimir's choice is an example of a negative allocation, where people are very sensitive to loss rather than to gain. So having one of your eyes taken out is not a gain. Okay. Would we get the same results if there was positive social allocation? You get more money than the outgroup does. And that has not been clarified. Okay? And at that point, I think my time is up. And that's it. Questions? Yes, sir.
There's been some some recent research on what's been called partisan discrimination, that
Mhm.
is discrimination against members of the opposing political party.
Mhm.
The research there shows that the effect sizes are actually very large, and in some cases larger than effect sizes found for racial or gender discrimination.
Right.
Would you consider partisan discrimination to be analogous to the other arbitrary set discrimination
That's
that
right.
you talked about?
Partisanship would be another arbitrary set. So what should happen, if the logic of our analysis is correct, is that the tendency to discriminate against, if you're a Democrat, to discriminate against Republicans should be conditioned by the gender, your gender, and the gender of the target, such that the highest rate of discrimination based on political partisanship should be if you're a male participant making a judgment or allocation of a male target. That's the prediction.
And it hasn't been tested to your...
That has not been tested, no.
Interesting.
That's a good topic for a dissertation, perhaps. Yes, Dan?
So, I think I know your thoughts on this, but you didn't elaborate on it in the course of your presentation, perhaps because we're covering so much material. But the difference between men's responses to outgroup men and men's responses to outgroup women could be due solely to the threat that outgroup men pose as competitor.
Okay, I got you. I see where you're coming from. The only problem with that interpretation is that threat or perceived threat is not exogenous. That is to say, males perceive more threat from outgroup males, not only because outgroup males are more dangerous, but because they're perceived to be more dangerous over and above their actual danger. Okay.
You're right. That's a brilliant point. I wish it was the one that I was going to make. Instead, what I was getting toward is that it could be the case that outgroup females, rather than being seen as exclusively being seen as non-threatening, might be seen as having positive affordances. That is what anthropologists call hypergamy, the tendency for women to be able to marry up the social ladder in a way that men cannot. So that the latitude, if you will, that in-group males give to out-group females could owe not exclusively to their less threatening nature, but also to their value to the in-group males. And it doesn't seem to me that the results that you presented adjudicate between the possibility that it's exclusively about threat or it's about the intersection of threat and resource.
Absolutely correct. I agree with you. But I'm not just trying to make a threat argument. Okay? Even in situations which are not non-threatening, like the Vladimir's allocation situation, you still find the same tendency. So over and above the fact that outgroup males are perceived to be more threatening is a tendency to stick it to, so to speak, outgroup males more than outgroup females. Because outgroup females are not just regarded as a competitive source, but as a resource for in-group males. Okay? Something to be fought over, not fought against. But we don't have data supporting that hypothesis. But that is one interpretation, the interpretation we put on that. Yes, ma'am.
How does sexual orientation, gender fluidity?
That good question. We haven't looked at it yet, but we assume that sexual orientation will be regarded not as a gendered category, but as an arbitrary set. That's our assumption. We don't know if that's true or not. We simply haven't studied it yet. So that's one more on the to-do list. Yes, Michelle.
I'm wondering about a possible limitation on your really great data challenging the double jeopardy hypothesis regarding black females. Because your research has focused on things like earnings, etc., and non-sexual things, I'm wondering what you would say if the purpose of the study was to examine the sense of
exploitation and entitlement that maybe white males have with respect to coercing black females in the sexual realm, as opposed to white females. I'm probably not the first one to try to articulate some limitation on the double jeopardy, I guess, when it comes to black females
That's
in
a
that
different,
realm.
I understand your question, and I've heard it before.
Okay.
And the answer to that is, the discrimination against females is not an arbitrary set system. It's a gendered system.
True, true.
And the gendered system, females suffer from the gendered system, regardless of whether they're black, white, Latino, green, pink, whatever. So that's a different system, right? Just like to say, well, females are more likely to be raped than males are. And rape is a gendered form of discrimination, not an arbitrary set discrimination. So the argument only applies to arbitrary set distinctions.
Right, well, so that's why I was trying to compare the vulnerability of black females to that kind of exploitation versus the vulnerability of white females.
And our argument, our expectation is, no, that black females should not be exposed to sexual exploitation at a higher rate than white females are. That both females, white and black, are susceptible to patriarchy to the same degree.
The same degree.
That's the
But it has been
expectation.
tested?
But has not been tested.
Okay.
Okay. But that, there is an expectation of what it should be.
Yeah, I understand what the theory says.
Right, that's what the theory says. Yes, sir.
Some of your measurements you were doing, like on capital specifically, they started in the 1960s. Is there anything like that you looked at maybe in the 50s, considering that there's a lot of political corrections in the 60s onwards?
Well, in the income data, we looked at data from 1960, 1980, and 2000. So that's a long, and the intergenerational transmission of wealth looked at this phenomena over the period of 30 to 40 years. So in those data, they're not locked into a given time period, but they stretch out over long swaths of time. And the fact that the income data per unit education didn't change an iota over 20 years is, I think, very telling. Okay. And these are not sort of small samples, these are census data. So we're dealing with thousands of respondents, tens of thousands of respondents. Yes, sir.
You started your talk by pointing out there are a few exceptions, right, in all the animal species.
Well, those, yeah.
Do you understand what led to those exceptions?
That's a very good question. So if we take the most dramatic exception to patriarchy, among the spotted hyena, we don't know why that particular species is matriarchal rather than patriarchal. I mean, there's some speculations about it, but there's not a good worked out theory of why that is the case, unless, Dan, you happen to know of. I don't know of any
The
good
difference
theory.
between chimps and bonobos, does anyone understand?
Well, the difference is that chimps are extremely patriarchal, and bonobos less so. But they're still patriarchal. I mean, they, by themselves, as individuals, they are. The difference is that they are thwarted by the political coalitions of female bonobos. So the female coalitions simply won't allow male bonobos to get very far in their domination. Yes, sir.
Hi. First, super interesting stuff. I was wondering if anybody has, or if you and your group has looked at, replicating this in a society where there's a heavily male-biased adult sex ratio, to see if that sort of pushes the results around.
Well, that belongs to one of my bullet points about things to be done, right? We haven't looked at all societies across the globe equally. I mean, most of these data come from the industrialized countries of Sweden, the United States, and England. We need to replicate this in non-industrial societies to see whether or not we get the same phenomenon. We don't know that yet. So that's to be done.
Just following up briefly, I mean, certainly, I think that's an important, I applaud you for encouraging work in small-scale societies. The question of biased sex ratios is not exclusive to those, so that
Right.
in India and China, for example, through selective female infanticide and abortion, they're very skewed sex ratios. I mean, if I understand the theory correctly, it would predict that the more male bias the sex ratio, the more extreme the subordinate male outgroup effect should be, because the stakes are higher when there are fewer women to go around. Conversely, the more female bias, the more that it should ameliorate the discrimination against outgroup males. It doesn't predict that it would eliminate it, because there's always a limited supply, even when it's a female bias sex ratio. But it's a study that could be done in contemporary China, for example.
Or take another society like post-World War II Russia, which had an extreme sex imbalance between males and females. Do these phenomena differ depending on, in that environment, of skewed male-female ratios? That would be something one could do as well, but we haven't done that yet. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Are there any of these like arbitrary sets among other social animals, or is that like a unique human thing? So I know you can have the internal hierarchies.
Yes, there are. And they're found among chimps, especially most dramatically. Chimps are a ferocious species, okay? So what chimp groups do, when they get to a certain size, they fissure, they split up. And chimps who are formerly members of Group A, rather than Group B, they patrol they become very territorial. And if a member of Troop A, former member of Troop A, is caught alone, that chimp is much more likely to be murdered by his former co-nationals. So that's one example of high levels of arbitrary set discrimination among chimpanzees, at least. So they tend to be very xenophobic. That's not the case among bonobos, right, who tend to be xenophilic. Right? They tend to be very friendly to members of outgroups.
From your long experience with studying these reasons and the characteristics of discrimination, do you have ideas on how to fight it?
I'm not a policy guy. I make no recommendations about how to make it smaller or ameliorate this tendency. What I'm trying to do is try to understand the dynamics of it as much as possible.
But would you say that from the understanding, some policies could be suggested, or you prefer not to?
I prefer not to make those kinds of suggestions, but if forced to, I would say that it's very important when trying to ameliorate this, that more attention be paid to in-group or out-group males, what happens to them in school, in the labor market, in the educational sector, etc. They're the ones who are double jeopardy, not the females. Females are doing just fine, thank you very much, for the most part. So our attention's been focused on the wrong thing. But beyond that, I make no policy recommendations. Yes?
Yeah, I'm wondering, it seems like there's potentially a tension between the idea that one group is dominant to another group, but they're also afraid of that group.
Right.
And I mean, I can see ways in which you could get that, but I'm wondering if some of your findings couldn't be interpreted as instead some sort of a predatory response rather than a fear response. So, you know,
Absolutely,
when you
I
shoot the
complete-
person, it's not, I mean, you're taking them out in some
Right.
way.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing. It's not simply that the outgroup males pose a greater threat. They're perceived to pose a greater threat, but there is a predatory orientation towards outgroup members, especially among humans and chimpanzees. That's not the case, as I said before, among bonobos. But chimps are perhaps almost as predatory to outgroups as humans are. Almost, but not quite. We're an extreme example of very predatory species.
Yeah, I mean, because it seems like some of the conditioning studies, I mean, those are always, well, they're conventionally interpreted as being about fear.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about what they're actually measuring, right, it's the resistance to extinction between an association, between some sort of arousal
Mm-hmm.
and the stimulus. And I just wonder if that could be reinterpreted as some sort of attention-focusing mechanism
Mm-hmm.
that has more to do with the kind of predatory response than the kind of fear that you would have towards a predator, where I mean, if you're the prey and that stimulus is the predator, you just want to get out of there. Whereas it seems like the response that people make in these things, you know, is they want to kill the person. Right? I mean, you have these shooter kind of responses, and I wonder if there isn't a potential interpretation of those resistance to extinction as being more like an attention-focusing mechanism.
Well, and as I tried to say before, I'm very eclectic when it concerns interpretation of the data. I think there is some rational fear response involved, some predatory fear response involved, and you know, this outgroup xenophobia involved. I think all three of those mechanisms are probably at work. So I'm not giving precedence to one of these interpretations over the other. Yes, sir.
Within, you know, looking at the effect within sex, within male, you know, bias that you've looked at, is there any, do you see the same absence of a double jeopardy effect when you're looking at a, you know, minority class? So if you've got sort of like two, you know, arbitrary set, like an intersection of two arbitrary set distinctions, is there a triaging where there's sort of a, you know, if you're making a distinction, you want to deal with somebody who's in an outgroup along two of these arbitrary sets as opposed to one, or is it sort of, you don't see that sort of multiplicative or additive effect?
Well, we haven't looked at that very much. We've only looked at one arbitrary set at a time. But it would be, the theory would at least support the expectation that if you had two arbitrary sets or more arbitrary sets, the same basic pattern of result should be found. So that's one way of falsifying the theory, right? To see whether it holds for just single arbitrary sets or multiple arbitrary sets. But I don't see anything theoretically which would dictate that it'll work for only one arbitrary set as opposed to two or three. So I'm going to be theoretically restrictive in that sense, and only change the expectation when we're forced to. Yes, sir.
Have you looked at any female-dominated jobs like nursing to see if these effects hold? So in a case where like most nurses are females, I'm sure most senior nurses are females.
In terms of the
The
invariance hypothesis? Yeah, we have looked at that. We've controlled for things like job titles, job experience, levels of gender equity or egalitarianism, and the gender difference between males and females tends to be constant over all of these possible distinctions. We found no evidence of an interaction when it concerns SDO and gender. It tends to be invariant. So we have looked at that. And we paid a lot of attention to that because it's a good alternative explanation. Maybe if we were to compare white compare female police officers to male police officers, we find the difference between males police officers and not to go away. But that's not what we find. Even among people in the same profession, the difference in SDO based on sex remains constant. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if your theory allows some salvaging of the double jeopardy hypothesis or observation in so much as your all else equal clause. So in a patriarchal system, presumably a woman's protection against exploitation will be partly derived from the strength of her male supporters.
Right.
And then if you've got the arbitrary set discrimination with a dominant and a subordinate group, would women of the subordinate group be then systematically disadvantaged because their men are disadvantaged and thus certain kinds of exploitation are more available?
It is true. We're not saying that female subordinates are going to have the same life opportunities as female dominants. They'll make more money, have better lives because of the support they get from their brothers, the male members of their group, brothers, husbands, lovers, friends. That'll be the case. But what the theory is really saying is that targeted discrimination against females on the basis of being a member of a given arbitrary outgroup, that won't exist for females. And any difference between subordinate females, dominant and subordinate, will be purely incidental.
Right.
Okay? Yes, Dan?
So I appreciate your caution when it comes to policy translations. The problem, of course, always is that somebody ends up making policy, and sometimes those people are informed and sometimes they're not. Picking up on Clark's point about the distinction between seeing an outgroup member as a threat and seeing them as
an
opportunity for exploitation or elimination, right? It strikes me that, and I know that work that you've done with Carlos Navarrete and that he's done subsequent to working with you, that in-group women see out-group men as a threat,
right?
But they don't see them as prey to be eliminated, right?
Right.
So a policy translation of that would be, well, so in-group men have a double incentive to eliminate or suppress out-group men compared to the single incentive that in-group women do. And therefore, that the more that women are in charge, whatever the situation, whether it's in government or in private firms, the less you would see the costs of being an out-group male realized, because the women have less incentive to persecute the out-group men compared to the in-group men in those positions.
Well, that's you sort of indirectly making me go to a policy recommendation, which I don't want to do.
There's an election on Tuesday.
Don't think of it as a threat, think of it as an opportunity.
But I agree with you in part, because those societies which have greater levels of gender egalitarianism tend to be less oppressive in general, right? So there's, in Sweden, which is a very, relatively speaking, gender egalitarian societies, the level of racial discrimination and religious discrimination is lower. It's generally a much less combative, violent kind of societies. So if you had a choice between electing a male politician or a female politician, I think the answer is clear as to what you should do.
I think that's probably a high note on which we do. Thanks, Jim. And,